Right, so welcome back to Adventure 82. Today we're doing a bit of a history story time rather than a history explore. So if you're from the Channel Islands, you'll be fully aware that the islands were the only part of the UK that was occupied by Nazi Germany back during the Second Small Disagreement. And one of the most iconic stories, I believe, anyway, to come out of the island of Jersey was the one of Louisa Gould. Um, who helped look after an escaped slave worker who came to be known as Bill. There's actually been a BBC documentary on it, but I've always wanted to do this story for the YouTube channel. So, without any further ado, and I hope you enjoy it, this is the story of Louisa Gould. Right, so before we talk about Louisa, let's talk about Theodore, which was Bill's real name. Theodore came from what's now the Ukraine, was then the USSR. And in 1941, when the Germans decided to invade Russia, which most people will mark as the downfall of the small disagreement that changed the tide, he was drafted at the age of 21 into the Russian Air Force to defend his country. And it was on one of his missions in October 1941 over Germany, where he was shot down by an anti-aircraft gun, and consequently taken prisoner and placed in a prisoner of war camp. In June 1942, however, the Germans had made some decisions, and one of those decisions they made was that all soldiers behind enemy lines would now be put in concentration camps and not just prisoner of war camps. They would be put to work as well. So with that in mind, Theodore, along with a load of thousands, if not hundreds, of soldiers, were loaded onto various trains going off to various parts of Europe. Theodore's train landed him in St. Malo, on the coast of France, before he was then taken out the train, loaded onto a boat, and arrived in the small island of Jersey. Theodore found himself in Camp Immelman, which was a small concentration camp. Essentially, it was for workers. It was nowhere near as bad as the ones would have been on Europe. So I suppose someone might say he was lucky. That's a matter of opinion. But that's where he ended up. And it's worth noting at this point that in the Channel Islands, they had their own kind of localized way of dealing with everything the Germans had done. So Jersey had its own little camp there. There was another small camp in Guernsey, and then the island of Alderney was just one massive concentration camp where people would be moved to and from the various parts of the islands to build the various fortifications that were built around the island. But going back to Theodore decided very quickly after arriving in the island in Camp Immelman that he wasn't going to spend the rest of his life in a concentration camp. This just isn't what he wasn't willing to do that. So after two failed attempts at trying to escape the camp and being brought back by the Germans and put to even harder labour than he had been before his punishment, on the third attempt, he managed to escape, and he escaped, and he was running down what was then a rural road, a very rural road in St. Ones. As you'll know, if you've been to the island is still very rural, especially in St. Ones. And he came across the farmhouse that was owned by René Lamotti. Now, when he came across René Lamotti, it was blatantly obvious to René from the start that he was a escape prisoner from the camp. So René took him into his kitchen, where he gave Theodore a glass of milk. And Theodore just about managed to gulp this glass of milk down before fainting and collapsing on the floor. And it wasn't until the following morning when Theodore came round that he then started explaining exactly how they were being treated in the camp, and what was happening to the other prisoners and soldiers that were being held there. So consequently, Rene decided to help Theodore, and he was there for the small time of 3 months. But in these 3 months, Rene's 4 children had grown quite partial to Theodore, looking at him rather like a big brother, if you like. And that's where Theodore picked up the nickname Bill. And then from there on, Theodore was known as Bill to everybody within the island of Jersey. And for us now, we'll be calling him Bill from now on. And that was him for 3 months until one day, whilst working on his farm, Rene noticed that there was a bunch of Gestapo agents who were the secret German police heading towards his farm house, because all soldiers that were brought in as part of slave work in the Channel Islands were all checked in by Organisation Todd. So it was a very, very strict affair. Not that there was any. So with that in mind, Rene knew exactly what was coming, and he knew that someone somewhere, because there were people within the local community who would report these kind of things to the Germans, knew exactly what they were coming for, and they were coming for Theodore. So he promptly ran back to the farmhouse and managed to get Theodore out of the area entirely, literally at the last minute, just before the Gestapo arrived to search his entire farm area. Theodore, though, now found himself an escaped prisoner with, at the moment at least, nowhere to go. So Theodore, desperately trying to find himself somewhere else to stay, was trying to find any kind of building that may help. And as he was roaming around the rural roads of St. Juan's, trying to make sure he wasn't noticed, he came across a shopkeeper he remembered from whilst he was staying at Rene's. That shopkeeper being our subject of the video, Louisa Gould. On approaching Louisa Gould and explaining his situation and his plight, Louisa took him in, and after thinking long and hard about it, she decided she was going to hide him the same way that Rene had been doing, because she remembered and was still fresh in her memory the pain of losing her son, Edward, not even a year earlier, and she wasn't willing to let another mother's son die. So she took Bill in, as he was then known all the time. And this was a turning point for who was then now known as Bill, because Louisa, with the help of her sister Ivy, her brother Harold, and a few of her friends, were able to teach him English, fluent English, with a French accent to try and help disguise the fact that he was a Russian slave worker. But that would only go so far. So it was still blatantly obvious to the local community, which was the worry, that he was Russian. The English with a French accent may well have fooled the Germans, but it wasn't going to fool the locals. And with them all acutely too aware that there were locals willing to dump them in it with the Germans, they had to come up with another way of making him seem legal within the island, whilst he was out and about. So it was around about this time that Louisa had placed a insurance claim for a burn on her rug that she'd got from some coals that had fallen out of fire and burnt her rug. And the insurance company only had one employee on the island at the time, that being the man, a very famous man within the German resistance within Jersey, Bob Le Sueur. And Bob when he went over to Louise's to finish up and finalise the paperwork for this claim, met Bill for the first time, and it was blatantly obvious to Bob as well that he was in fact Russian. You couldn't mistake him for anything else. But Bill, being part of the resistance, had an idea. So he kept his ears to the ground and he tried his best to help Louisa. And what happened was a local gentleman had actually lost his pass, his ID card, his German ID card. And this particular ID card, Bob managed to get hold of. And after some modifications, including putting Bill's picture on it, and tweaking some of the distinguishing features, so obviously it matched his picture, then he was able to at least go around relatively unscathed. And that kept Bill safe for now. So everything was going fine for Bill and Louisa. Louisa was teaching Bill his English along with help from her brother and her sister, and everything was ticking on fine until May of 1944, when a letter was sent to the Germans to inform them of Bill's presence at Louisa's house, which was also her shop. Because you can imagine a shop obviously has people going in and out all the time, and you don't know who you're serving. You don't know where they align, and if they're going to tell something to the Germans, they're definitely not going to tell you. Fortunately for Louisa, to a point, this letter was seemingly, from what we can tell, misaddressed. So instead of sending it to Victoria College House, which is where the Germans' headquarters were based at the time, they sent it to Victoria College, which means the person who actually received the letter first was the principal of Victoria College. Obviously, being a local gentleman, before passing it on to the Germans, he promptly made Louisa aware of the situation and the fact that someone had ratted Bill out. So consequently, Bill was swiftly taken by Bob LeSueur, who came to help Louisa, and he was taken to her sister's house, whilst Louisa, with the help of one of her friends, removed all evidence of Bill from the building, from where he'd been being hidden in the underfloor cupboard, to the shop, the house, everything. And so they believed that they would perceivably get away with everything and everything would be okay, because there was no reason why it shouldn't work out. Unfortunately, when the Germans came around the following day, which was 25th of May 1944, despite the large efforts by Louisa Gould and her friend to remove all evidence of Bill, in their rush to clear everything, they'd missed one thing: a Russian to English dictionary, which, as far as the Germans were concerned, despite the fact Bill was no longer there and they didn't know where this missing Russian was more than enough to convict Louisa. So at that point, Louisa was arrested and taken away by the Germans. Right, so following Louisa's arrest, Bob LeSueur, after helping Bill escape from Louisa's to her sister Ivy's, returned to Ivy's house after Louisa's arrest, advising that they move both Bill and another Russian escaped worker that Ivy had been helping before Bill arrived, called George, to try and stop Ivy from ending up in the same trouble that her sister was in. Because if they'd arrested Louisa, it wasn't going to be long before the Germans turned up on Ivy's doorstep too. Ivy was adamant that they would be fine. And it wasn't until Ivy's husband came home from work and Bob spoke to him as well that they both said, no, he's better off somewhere else, for both us and him. So Ivy reluctantly agreed with her husband and Bob. Bob never told Ivy where he was taking Bill or George, feeling that this would be the safest option for Ivy because she can't tell the Germans what she doesn't know, which she hoped would keep her out of trouble. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work out that way for Ivy. Just a week after her sister had been arrested, the Germans turned up and they raided Ivy's house too. At which point, Ivy herself was also arrested for helping these Russians, these escaped prisoners. And at the same time, not long after that, the last person to be arrested was Harold, her brother, or their brother. And it's also worth noting at this point as well that a couple of Louise's friends were also arrested at this point as well, just for aiding in listening to a band radio set. So, with the trial being complete on the 22nd of June 1944, they were all sentenced. Ivy was sentenced to 5 months and 15 days for prohibited use of a reception of a wireless device, so for having a radio, essentially. And she was sentenced as well to being sent across to a prison. Fortunately for Ivy, the General Hospital forged papers saying that she was not well enough to leave, so Ivy was fortunate enough to escape this. Harold, her brother, and Louisa weren't so lucky. So Harold had been sent to Balstein concentration camp for a total of 5 months. And Louisa got the worst sentence of all. She was sentenced to 2 years imprisonment for failing to surrender. I'm having to read this to you from the computer. A wireless radio, prohibited reception of a wireless transmission, and abetting breach of working the peace and unauthorized removal. She was sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp, which is also known to be one of the most vicious, where she initially gave English lessons before falling ill, which was never a good sign. And Louisa fell ill in 1945. Now, she was reasonably safe teaching English, but she got to the point where she was so ill that the Germans decided she was no use to them anymore. So on the 13th of February, 1945, just mere months before the end of the Second World War, Louisa Gould was put to death in the gas chambers. So after the liberation of Jersey on the 9th of May 1945, obviously the Allied forces then emptied out all the concentration camps, and Harold was reunited with his sister Ivy. And Louisa's story was echoed for some time afterwards. In 1995, Ralph, who was the only person left alive at that point, Ivy and Harold had previously died, was at an unveiling in just by St. One's Parish Hall, where they unveiled a stone to commemorate the bravery of his mother. It was also at this point that he was able to meet Bill, that all those years ago his mother had tried to protect. Theodore coming over as well to witness the unveiling, never forgetting what Louisa had done for him. Right, so that's it here for me, Adventure 82, and that's the story of Bill and Louisa Gould, a lady that did extraordinary things in very difficult circumstances. And I'd like to think that despite the way the world seems to be right now in 2025, that if the same situation happened, that somebody would do that for me. And that obviously I would do the same thing for someone else. But the world doesn't seem to be as kind as maybe it once was, depending where you are. We're still fighting various wars around the world. It's sad to think that we still haven't learned, really. But on a slightly more cheerful note, we'll be out and about next week. I've got some well, I think anyway, very interesting abandoned smelt mills coming up. I'm hoping to get some footage of some bunkers and stuff from a trip me and Eric are taking, or hoping to take down to Kent. And we'll see you for those. As for what happens in the meantime, who knows? This channel's very much a case of what I can get hold of, what I can get. It's a random one. It's history at. I would like to say it's best because it's as random as history it really is. It just is. If you enjoyed this, do subscribe. If you want to go back and see me out and about, because I'm not normally sat here like this just telling you something, feel free. Otherwise, I'll see you next week, and have a lovely week, whatever it is you get up to. Right, I can use mine.